Please give a warm welcome to the host of Broadway Buzz, Mr. Joe Gary.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Broadway Buzz, and welcome to Parade. Parade is a kind of landmark musical. It just reopened in New York, and it would win the Tony Award for Best Revival of a Musical and a Tony Award for the Best Direction. And it's an extraordinary work, and we really see it in a new way. And that's because of the genius of the director and the way he's presented the show. Tragically, this is a story, of course, about a young girl in 1913 who was raped and murdered, and the accuser was a Jewish man who was her boss at a factory in the South, and it's a devastating story. It still reverberates today. The case is still in the courts in Georgia, and it's something that we reconsider. It's a story about anti-Semitism. It is a story about the worst kind of bigotry, and the focus is 1913, 50 years after the Civil War, but clearly the story is still as pertinent today as it was then. So you're in for a very rare experience. I want to remind you, of course, you're not seeing a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical tonight, that's for sure. What you're really seeing is a modern Greek tragedy. Remember, Aristotle said about a tragedy, we watch a series of events that culminate in a catastrophic conclusion. And that's exactly what happens in this brilliant show. The critics in New York this time referred to it as a work of art, and it is. I want to remind you that the ancient critics, when they reviewed the great tragedies, always talked about the idea that through suffering comes wisdom, and that is certainly true in this story. One of the things that makes this story come alive in such a special way, and you'll watch for it, and I'll point things out for you, is that the story that revolves around the relationship between Leo Frank, the accused, and his wife, Lucille, will culminate into a very beautiful and powerful love story. So watch for those soaring love songs that happen in the second act. And again, as the ancient Greeks realized, that it is through enduring all emotions that we come to a sense of well-being, and we come to a sense of epiphany about life. And in this dark age we live in, where we're still dealing so significantly with anti-Semitism and racism and injustice in the judicial system, it takes on an incredible power for us. Okay, so let's go to the beginning of this story. Okay, so the time is April 26th, 1913. A 13-year-old child, Mary Phelan, works in a pencil factory, where she puts the erasers on the pencil. She is paid 10 cents an hour. At the opening of the story, we meet her as she goes to the factory. She's just been laid off. She's going to the factory to get her remaining pay from her boss, and the boss is Leo Frank, a Jewish man from New York who runs the factory in Atlanta, Georgia. Her pay, incidentally, is $1.20. Leo Frank would probably be the last person to see her alive. The next morning, her body was found in the basement of the pencil factory, raped and murdered. And it would explode into an extraordinary trial where Leo Frank is accused of the rape and murder of this child. An extraordinary tale. And it involves a corrupt prosecutor. It involves a very anti-Semitic editor of a newspaper. Everyone is out to make their name and to do a spin. At one point, they consider there was also a black man who was the janitor, and as they're putting the case together, they say, that isn't good enough. And so they look at a Jewish northerner as the guilty party. And, you know, what he was guilty of was being a northerner and being Jewish. It's a horrifying tale. You know, some of the great supporters of Leo Frank at the end, Henry Ford and Thomas Edison, and most everyone in the northern press took exception with the violation of what was going on in the press, in the media, and in the courtroom. So it's an extraordinary tale, and we just watch it keep going to its ultimate catastrophic conclusion. But in the process, there is beauty, there is a love story, and there is insight that reminds us of the power of the past and how the past keeps reoccurring until we learn something from it. Watch the opening number of the show. It's called The Old Red Hills of Home, and it starts in 1863. And we watch a young Confederate soldier saying goodbye to his young, innocent lover as he goes off to war. Within the course of this monumental opening song, it's like an anthem song. I mean, you almost feel like you have to stand and salute when you hear it. It's so powerful. But what happens at the end of the song is 50 years have passed, and we are now in 1913, and we are really ready to do the parade, which is the Confederate Memorial Day Parade, which is the basis of our story. Watch, though, how brilliantly they use that opening song at the end of the show. So it gives us a framework for the show. At the end of the show, the young boy is going off to the First World War, and we see that the cycle continues. Very powerful music. It is brilliantly sung. There is a very large cast in this show, and the sound of the music is extraordinary. I want you to really think that instead of going and seeing a Broadway musical, you're really seeing a modern opera. And the show has 30 songs in it. Most Broadway musicals have like 21, 22 songs. But listen carefully to the brilliance of the lyrics in this show. Keep in mind, the composer-lyricist is Jason Robert Brown, and it is his debut show when it was first premiered in 1998 in New York. And listen to the lyrics. They are as powerful as Sondheim's lyrics, and they move the story forward. There is so little spoken dialogue in the show that when you hear the cast recording of the show, you're literally hearing the entire show. Okay, so let us go back to the beginning then and see how all of this happened. The making of the musical then, 1997, New York City, we're looking at Alfred Ury. Alfred Ury is the writer of the book of this musical. He's known for creating 3 brilliant shows about the South. He really is, the most important writer from Atlanta who has really given us insight to what life was like in the Jewish South, 50 years ago. So Alfred Ury would write his first play. It was part of what he called the Atlanta trilogy, and that play was Driving Miss Daisy. And as you know, it was one of the most beloved plays. It was about an old Jewish matriarch, and she had a black driver, and it's about their relationship between the chauffeur and the woman. And it deals with issues of race, it deals with issues of black and white, it deals with issues of being Jewish in the South in that period, but it was a greatly loved play that literally played in every major theater capital of the world. And as you remember, it was also turned into a brilliant film. The second play of his Atlanta trilogy was a work work called Last Night at Ballyhoo. And again, it takes place in 1939 in Atlanta, just as they're about to celebrate the opening of Gone with the Wind. And of course, this prominent Jewish family was very involved in making the preparations for the world press and all of the famous people of the world to gather in Atlanta to see what would be one of the most beloved movies ever made. So that's a delightful story also. And then his third work would be the libretto for Parade. So he would meet and work with Harold Prince. Of course, we all know Harold Prince. For 50 years, he would dominate the American theater, from Fiddler on the Roof and West Side Story to Cabaret to Company and Sweeney Todd. He was an extraordinary artist, but it was right up his alley. Of course, we remember the phenomenal impact he had with Cabaret, which was a story that dealt with horrific anti-Semitism. So for Alfred Urey to go to Harold Prince was sort of the natural connection. And Harold Prince loved the story and thought it would make a magnificent theater piece. Again, Harold Prince always moved away from doing the obvious kind of musical. So the end result was he went to Stephen Sondheim, hoping he would talk him into writing the music, and Stephen Sondheim turned him down. Again, it was a natural for Stephen Sondheim. Remember, he would go on later to do a large number of very dark pieces like Sweeney Todd and like Assassins, very, very dark themes. But he turned the project down. And happily, Hal Prince had a young daughter named Daisy, who's gone on to be a very prominent figure in New York theater now. And Daisy at the time was very connected with a young composer lyricist who had not yet been represented on Broadway, and that was Jason Robert Brown. So connected Harold Prince with Jason Robert Brown. It's a perfect piece for both men to work on. I want you to listen carefully. What's so compelling when you hear this musical is the range of music in the show and how perfectly appointed each song is to the person who's singing at that moment. It's not only the quality of the song and the melodic quality of the song, but again, listen carefully to the lyrics, because the lyrics drive everything in this story. There's next to no dialogue. So we're taking very complex court testimony and we're dealing with it in the lyrics of the show. There is a brilliant book that's called The Dead Shall Rise. And it's a 900-page work that I staggered through, but it really gives tremendous insight to the miscarriages of justice that happened in this show. And it's amazing to see when you sit, after I read the book, I went back and listened to the musical score for Parade, and it's amazing how much of this huge story is really consolidated into this stunning musical adventure you're going to be on. Okay, so what would happen? The show would open in New York in 1998. It opened at the Vivian Beaumont Theater, which is part of Lincoln Center in New York. Lincoln Center is comparable to Playhouse Square, and it houses, of course, New York City Opera, the Metropolitan Opera, and also it houses the ballet companies in New York. And also then there is this theater that is called the Vivian Beaumont Theater. And for many years, it was a subscription theater where, like at Playhouse Square, patrons would buy a subscription to this season. But what makes Lincoln Center unique in the Vivian Beaumont Theater is it is considered a Broadway theater. So therefore, shows that play there are eligible for Tony Awards. It seats 1,005 people. It's the only thrust stage on Broadway, and so therefore it's a very desirable theater to work in. Many of the great revivals of favorite musicals, like The King and I and South Pacific, would start there. So the end result is Harold Prince staged a magnificent production. It had a huge cast, and the orchestration was like an orchestration for an opera. So it had a very large musical ensemble playing it, a very large singing ensemble singing the show, and it starred Brent Carver. You remember Brent Carver was a great Canadian actor who worked at Stratford for many years, who went on and became a New York star when he appeared in Kiss of the Spider Woman with Chita Rivera. And so several years after that triumph, he was given this role in Parade. I just want to tell you a story about Brent. He was a very close friend. My partner and I did a musical, an original musical that was called The Arabian Night, K-N-I-G-H-T, which was a story about the great explorer Sir Richard Burton. And we did it at the Cleveland Playhouse, and it had great success, and it was being optioned for a New York production. Meanwhile, Brent Carver came to see it as a friend. He loved it and wanted the Mirvishes in Canada to produce it. So we were very excited about this option. He, of course, would have been perfect to play the role on Broadway. So we agreed to move on this project. And that same week, Brent Carver was offered the lead in Kiss of the Spider Woman. So that was a great success for him, and it really stopped the development of that show for us. But that's show business, what can I tell you? All right, so in any case, Brent Carver was magnificent in this production. The critics loved the production, but the show closed after 8 weeks. And the reason for it, it was in a limited run at Lincoln Center because other shows were coming in there. The producers of the show, when the show opened, opening night, it was the worst nightmare that could happen to a show, the producers filed bankruptcy. So the end result was the show was in, sort of legal hell. Nobody else could come in and say, well, we'll produce it on Broadway because the rights were all tied up and no one knew who really owned the rights, and Lincoln Center ended up having to pay the salaries for the 8 weeks of the actors there. So the tragedy of this show, even though it was considered a triumph, even though it introduced one of the greatest new voices musically, a composer, lyricist, to the New York scene, the show closed. And so over the years, there would be one-night concerts. Famous artists would do selections from Parade, but basically the show died tragically in New York. What would happen is in 2000, and there would be a tour, though, in 2000. They were able to get through all the legal hassle. It did play at Playhouse Square, incidentally, and it was very well received on the road. So again, what's happening is we have this kind of cult idea in New York. Sometimes if a show that's really worthy closes for an unusual reason, the end result is, that there are great devotees of that show and people who memorize every song and, could do the entire show for you on a moment's notice in your living room. And that's what happened. This cult built up around Parade. So in 2007, the show opened in London at the Donmar Warehouse. I speak often about the Donmar Warehouse, but let me define it a little more for you. It's a 250-seat theater that exists in the West End. It's really what we would call an off-Broadway theater, but also it is a subscription house, which means they do a series of plays every year. They find the greatest British directors to work there, the greatest British actors to perform there. And they've done a large number of musical revivals that have found their way to New York. So the Donmar Warehouse is a very important feed to commercial theater. And the next time you go to London, don't see everything on the West End. Take the opportunity of seeing something at the National Theater or go to the Donmar Warehouse. There are extraordinary things happening that find their way into the more commercial theater later on. So in any case, Parade would play in 2007 at the Donmar Warehouse in a greatly loved revival, having rave reviews in London, sweeping the Olivier Awards. The show did not transfer transfer to New York. Rather, it transferred to the Mark Taper Forum in Los Angeles for a very healthy run there. Okay, so again, the show died. So the time now is 2022. And let me introduce you again to New York City Center. In the 1990s, New York City Center was just like any Broadway house. It did not produce shows, it just was a space where you could do a Broadway show. Enter a young woman from Cleveland named Judy Dakin. Judy Dakin worked at Music Carnival. In the 1960s, when I was creating the theater department at Cleveland State, I used to encourage Judy to come and lecture very often at Cleveland State in my classes, and she would talk about the musical theater and the theater in the round, which was so unique at Music Carnival. She would go on to New York, where she would take BAM, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and turn it into one of the most innovative theater spaces in the world. And her theory was to bring the great experimental dance companies, opera companies, theater companies to the Brooklyn Academy of Music in a summer festival of new wave work, which continues to this day. And again, you should put that on your dance card. All right, in any case, she would leave BAM and go to New York City Center. And one of the first things she did was to create what was called the Encore series. This is one of the most important things that exists in New York. Several times a year, they present lost Broadway shows. And they mount them in a very brief period of time. They usually have less than 2 weeks. They have a very strict budget, but they hire very first-class directors because this gets a lot of New York attention. It gets international attention, actually. And then, all of the leading actors in New York are very happy to do this limited run, even though they're paid minimum salaries, and it doesn't even cover their parking in New York, but they're willing to do these shows because it gets a lot of attention. Of all of the Encore series, so Judy is, created this, which is an extraordinary cultural contribution to New York and the world of theater. And so over those years, 19 of the Encore series have been recorded because it's a reminder of the brilliance of the score, and then you hear it with new familiar voices of people you love on Broadway, and so it creates a lot of interest in doing the shows all over the world. One of the most famous examples of this, of course, was Chicago. Remember, Chicago would open in the original production, and it was very big, probably very overblown, too many sets, too much stuff, and it played with Chita Rivera and Gwen Verdon that had an extraordinary cast and great music, the Kander and Ebb music. But the show failed in New York because it couldn't keep up with all the financial responsibilities of keeping that huge show open, so it closed. So when it played at Encore, it was totally stripped down, a single set, single costumes. But what happened was it put this very strong focus on Bob Fosse's brilliant choreography, and also the focus on the brilliance of the music, the Kander and Ebb music. And so that would transfer exactly as it was created in this Encore series to Broadway, where it has become the second longest running show on Broadway. So Encore plays a very important part in the history of our musical theater. So thank you, Judy Dakin, for leaving Music Carnival and going on and giving New York such incredible venues. Okay, so we're now looking at the Encore production of Parade that would happen in 2022 in New York. Okay, so let me introduce you to the extraordinary young director who would bring this show to life in such an important way. His name is Michael Arden. Michael has had a career as a Broadway actor and also as a director. You can read his credits in the program. But as a director, he finds a way of taking works and giving them a new life. He took Spring Awakening, Riveting, for example, which was a great hit in terms of our musical theater, but he reimagined it for a deaf theater company, and it was extraordinary. He was nominated for a Tony for it, but he didn't win. And he also took a production of Once on This Island and gave it a whole new twist. So he had this reputation for revitalizing old shows. So Encore hired him to do Parade. Keep in mind, we always have this danger with Parade. One, we have this brilliant score. We have these brilliant arrangements. We have these brilliant roles for actors to play. But on the negative side of it, it's a very dark story, and how do you sell it commercially? And so his version of it will bring to life the power of the show in a very special way. I want you to realize, when you think about what a director does, he is the most important interpreter of the script. He is the one who originally is given the script. He spends months studying time and place. So in this case, Atlanta, 1913, 50 years after the Civil War. And he looks into all of the details. I mean, remember, in this period, this is the period of the Industrial Revolution, and people are moving away from farms, moving to cities, working in factories for slave labor prices under horrific conditions. And sadly, many of these factories were owned by Jewish businessmen, so there was this very anti-Semitic feeling about the rulers of factories taking advantage of young children, etc. So there's a lot of stuff brewing in 1913 that moves beyond racism and moves into anti-Semitism and moves into working conditions. And suddenly young girls who had been protected by their families on the farms are suddenly exposed to life in the city, and everything culturally sort of explodes. And so the director would work very carefully in understanding all of this. When he worked with the next person that the director works with is the set designer, long before he deals with the actors, long before he casts a show, and he creates the visual of the show. Watch this show. Again, remembering this had to be done in next to no time, spending next to no money on set. So what you have is the bare stage floor downstage. You have a large platform placed on the stage floor, about a foot above the stage floor. And then upstage, you have a square 30-foot platform that is about 3 feet high. So basically, you have 3 levels: this raised upstage level, the raised platform level, and the floor. Watch the brilliance of what he's able to achieve in the staging by just using these levels. Remember, that upstage area will become the courtroom. It will become the prison cell. It will become the place where the gallows will take place. So it's very simply done. The other thing that he does that's extraordinary, he uses the influence of the great director Bertolt Brecht. To remind you, Bertolt Brecht worked in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, well, through the 50s also in America. But he was German Jew, and he had to be very careful of living in Germany. So he kept moving through Europe, and he kept spreading his idea of a kind of theater that he called alienation, which meant that he used projections, and he would use signs that would say, in the case of Threepenny Opera, Polly Peachum, enters for the first time, and very simple little projections that would set up time and place. Watch how brilliantly that's used. On the front of that platform, you will see projections giving you time and place. In the other Brechtian way, as we introduce the major characters, we will see the actor playing it on stage, but then we will see the photograph of the real real Leo Frank or the real wife, Lucille, etc. So it's a wonderful device that works in an extraordinary and powerful way. So you're seeing a story that is a cavalcade, it is a parade, but it is a march to death. But in the process, we see these elevated scenes of love and support, and we fall in love with the central characters of this great tragedy. Please enjoy Parade.